Chapter 5 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gillian Pack. Clearing Weather by Carolyn Meigs. Chapter 5. White Oak and Meadow Larks. At the end of March, when the winds had begun to blow warm instead of cold, when the trilling of blackbirds was beginning to be heard in the marsh, and meadow larks, with their sweet, high voices, were singing on the fence rails, a line of timber wains came lumbering down the road which led out of the north country. The team of 4 great draft horses, which drew each one, was weary and mud-splattered. Their broad feet plodded laboriously over the last of the heavy miles. Beneath the wagon beams were slung those oak timbers of which Ephraim Havergal had sent word so many weeks before. Ships could be built of cedar or fir, but for the Jocasta there was to be used only the best of good white oak. There were, moreover, loads of smaller tree stems, and the great curving branches, which were to be cut into knees, thwarts, and rising timber. The little procession filed into the shipyard and drew up alongside the space where the slanted way and the keel blocks had already been prepared. The great enterprise was fairly begun. "I have often thought," Caleb Harmon said to Nicholas, as he laid out the shape of a crooked knee upon the accommodating angle of a tremendous oak bough so that the grain of the wood could run from one end to another. "I have often thought that the oaks must know that they are to be ships some day, and grow their branches to their proper shape. I believe instead that the men who first built ships took the bent oak branches and made the lines of stem and ribs and knees to fit them," Nicholas replied. "Perhaps the curve which stands without breaking against gales of wind is the true one to understand the stormy onslaught of heavy seas." The keel was laid. The curves of stem and stern post began to show. The ribs were set in proper line, and the form of the ship began to come into being. From the man whose simple task it was to cut the straight tree nails of tough locust wood, to the ship's carpenter of long-studied and uncanny skill, who fitted the planks over the rounded curve of the stern and the flare of the bows, there was not one who was not working with his whole heart in the task. "They toiled for your uncle, but there is a new ring to the hammers now that they are working, in part, for themselves," Caleb Harmon observed to Nicholas, standing beside the table in the outer room of the counting-house. Nicholas nodded without speaking, for he was busy over one of the full-sized drawings of which so many were needed in the building of the ship. Michael could occasionally help him a little with this portion of the work, but his assistance could not go very far. Very nearly the whole of the drawings must be done by Nicholas, who toiled over them for countless hours. So anxious was he that nothing should delay in the steady progress forward. Michael had proved himself invaluable in a score of ways. Immediately after that first afternoon in the shipyards, he had absented himself during the 3 days necessary for making a journey to and from Boston. On his return, he had put into Nicholas's hands a small leather bag which contained the 100 golden guineas which were to constitute his share of the capital. Small as was the amount in proportion to the cost of building the ship, any sum in gold was extraordinarily welcome. "There is fair magic in those gold coins," Caleb Harmon said, when a doubting merchant had hesitated long and sourly over promising the copper for the Jocasta's sheathing, and had suddenly turned into smiling acquiescence when an advance was paid him in jingling gold. With the country full of worthless paper money, that which in the unstable times was called hard money could work wonders. It was astonishing what Michael's guineas accomplished, and how far he and Nicholas, between them, managed to make them go. Just where he had obtained them was for a time not clearly revealed. He himself was 1,000 times more valuable than any money could be. He was clear-headed and quick-thinking, and was always ready to take upon himself any one of the endless tasks, big or little, which go with the proper management of any enterprise. He would work over pages of figures for endless hours. He would write countless letters and make expeditions either into the town or farther afield to gather the material that some unsuspected need would demand. A few of the men looked a little askance at the stranger from the south, until one day, when he passed through the yards, he found 6 men, desperate and intense, struggling with a task completely beyond them. A big timber had slid from its proper position, and as it settled slowly, was threatening to crush old John Ewing, who was pinned below it. The men had lifted and pushed, had strained and heaved, but with no success beyond checking a little the slow slipping of the beam. Michael, throwing off his coat, had added his sturdy shoulder to their spent efforts, and they had seen the heavy oak timber suddenly rise and move into its place, while John Ewing scrambled out quite unperturbed, and fell to work again as though nothing out of the way had happened. "He's got the strength of 3, but where does he carry it?" Old Ewing marveled aloud, regarding with grateful wonder Michael's slim, supple figure as he walked away. "I thought such, as he always had blacks to do their toiling and carrying for them," observed another of the astounded 6. "To think he could outlift us that's been at the task all our lives. There is more in the lad than we had believed." Michael's great gift was in dealing with his fellow men. In spite of his slave-holding parentage, he had chanced to have born within him the spirit of true comradeship with all of his own kind. Caleb Harmon, whom even Nicholas had found to be tough-willed and difficult to move, was his completely devoted adherent. There were certain matters in which Nicholas and the foreman did not think alike, for the boy was determined to draw away from the heavy, solid tradition which had modeled the ships of New England from earlier times. Caleb was stubbornly conservative in the matter of slimmer bows or lighter bracing, and he often uttered grumbling prophecies of, "You will rob her of all her strength, and will make her sail no better." Nicholas knew well that it is almost impossible to foretell how a ship will handle when at last she puts to sea. She may be either crabbed or sea-kindly. She may do her best in light airs or in a heavy wind. Whether she is to bring her designer pride or disappointment, only the final test can tell. All that her Creator can do is to put into her everything that he has of heart and hand and brain, and leave the issue to the incalculable proof by wind and weather. And this Nicholas was doing, ably seconded by Caleb and Michael, and by all the heartily toiling men who loved to think that she was partly their own. Beyond the long counting room was a smaller apartment where Nicholas's drawing table was set, and where he carried out his most intense hours of work. It had been Thomas Drury's special office, a modest, businesslike space, set at the very end of the long building, so that it actually rested upon the wharf. The walls were lined with shelves, cupboards, and lockers, with hull models of past Drury ships standing wherever there was room. The single door, opening into the larger counting house, was of heavy oak, so that when it was closed, there was complete quiet in the little place, save for that distant muffled sound of hammers, which could always be heard everywhere through the whole town, and for the lapping of the tide, rising and falling among the barnacled piles beneath the row of small windows. Often when Nicholas toiled late by flaring candlelight, and would at last put up his work and come out into the larger room to take his way homeward, he would find Michael all alone in the great shadowy counting-house, working at his own desk with his single candle a spot of brightness in the great cave of dark. And sometimes, when he had come so early in the morning that the sky still showed the red of sunrise through the windows, he would find, after he had been working an hour, and had chanced to go forth to fetch something from the outer counting-room, that Michael, in silent industry, had long been working there also. It was his policy never to disturb Nicholas when he knew that his comrade behind the closed door was busy with intricate design and more intricate calculation. There were times when Nicholas heard him remonstrating with some clerk or workman who would have knocked, or who had brought some errands which must be laid before Master Nicholas Drury himself. After a certain hour of the day, Nicholas would turn his energies to all these matters of business, which were constantly being referred to him. But over his tense toil at night or early morning, Michael was wont to watch with jealous zeal. Phoebe and Dolly, Nicholas knew, commented and protested each other over his long hours and his growing evidence of weariness. "The boy begins to have a look of his uncle," Caleb Harmon had said more than once, but Phoebe had told them all. "You say that if the enterprise is to be made a success, someone must toil, even as Nicholas is doing. The worst will soon be past, and until then there is no use in plaguing him with advice and remonstrance. We can only take such good care of him as we know how to do." Mr. Darius Corlund had long since taken his departure from the Blackbird Inn, and was heard to be very busy up and down the countryside, taking care of his new acres purchased from Thomas Drury. People complained that he was a harsh landlord, after the easy, kindly administration of the man whose tenants they once had been. "He asks in the village daily how the work is going forward," Mr. Hugh Hollister told Nicholas. "He says no word here for good or ill, but I know that among his great acquaintances in the nearby towns, among merchants and men who used to trade overseas, he speaks of your enterprise with scoffing, and declares that it is bound to come to disaster." "Men such as he do not wish to see the country prosper," Nicholas answered. Even in spite of what he heard, both from Mr. Hollister and others, he could not bring himself to believe that he had sufficient reason to betray Darius Corlund's Tory principles. "I cannot see that he can do us any serious harm," he told both himself and Mr. Hollister more than once. "There are many others besides Mr. Corlund who think little of our scheme, and say so." He could never quite put from his mind the recollection of that look which Darius Corlund had given him when the man's guilty mind seemed to be tracing the connection from Etienne Bardot to Nicholas Drury. Yet such was the press of his hard work that he could not give that uneasy memory any very great attention. He was even puzzled for some little time when his sister Dolly reported a very curious occurrence. "Mr. Joseph Ryle lodged with us last night," she said to Nicholas one day, when he had just returned from a brief journey to a town 50 miles distant. "He did not ask if you were here, although one or two of the things which he chanced to say made me think that he knew you were away. He had put on a manner of rather too affable and odious politeness when I brought him his supper, so that I was in no haste to come back and clear it away. But it seemed to me that I heard his footsteps stirring overhead, and when I went up, there he was in the upper passage just outside the door of your room. He seemed confused and said something about coming to see how my uncle did before he hurried past me down the stairs." When Nicholas mounted to his little chamber under the eaves, he found it in the same trim order in which it was always kept, but there were, nevertheless, certain small things set away carefully in unaccustomed places, which made him believe that perhaps some unwanted hand had been fingering his possessions. He spoke of the matter to Michael, who nodded wisely. "Darius Corlund's mind appears to dwell unhappily upon that letter. I think that he does not sleep quite easy of nights for wondering just where it is. It looks as though he had requested Joseph Ryle to find out for him." Michael did not lodge at the Blackbird Inn, for beyond the room or two which Phoebe was obliged to keep for passing travelers, there was no further accommodation. He lived, instead, with Mr. Hugh Hollister, and many were the tales which he told of that good man's trials with the high-handed, narrow-hearted Henrietta Sparrow. Even she had not been quite proof against Michael's engaging smile, but she showered upon him no luxuries of living in the house over which she held such iron sway. "She makes me as uncomfortable as she dares," said Michael, but she is a woman after all, and has some stirrings of mercy hidden behind that uncompromising exterior. There was one afternoon when Nicholas and Michael were finishing their work in the counting room that the just departing clerk said at the door, "Here are 2 men asking to see you, Mr. Drury." The 2 came in, an odd pair, one tall and shambling, with a long thin neck and inquisitive crafty eyes, the other somewhat shorter, and with a shifty expression no more pleasing than that of the first. They stood glancing uneasily about them, while the tall one finally stated their errand. "We wish to take employment with you." "Are you carpenters?" inquired Nicholas. He did not like the look of the 2, and was searching his mind as to where he had seen one or the other of those ungainly figures before. "We are riggers," the taller man answered readily, seeming to be the acknowledged spokesman of the 2. "And I can turn a hand at blacksmithing also. I can forge you bolts and beat out copper sheeting. In fact, I am a handy jack at a dozen sorts of work." "But you are not Branscombe men," Nicholas answered. "We are at present using only such workmen as have been with us for a great length of time. We have no need of others." "So be it," agreed the tall man, without protest. "It is true that we have worked at various trades, and have followed the sea also, until we are not from any place in particular, as such poor seafaring men may come to be. But we never had it held against us before. Moreover, we bore arms for our country in the late war." "And where was it you saw fighting?" Nicholas inquired. The other hesitated a moment, as though in calculation, and answered, though not very convincingly, "We were by the surrender of Yorktown, and the Carolina troops." Michael offered a question. "Was your commander a certain Colonel Powell, a great tall man with a tremendous roaring voice?" "Aye, that was he," replied the man quickly. "I knew him well. He commended me and recommended my promotion from the ranks for special bravery." Michael answered him with such a burst of laughter that the would-be veteran's sallow countenance changed abruptly, and he wheeled about and strode out of the room, saying as he did so, "Come, comrade, there is no kindness here for unfortunate men in search of honest labor." They went out, closing the door smartly upon the still unchecked mirth of Michael Slade. "I wish you could have seen what manner of man Colonel Powell really was," he said to Nicholas, after the disconcerted pair had disappeared. "A round, short fellow, with a chubby red face, and a voice that had forgotten to change, so that it was high and squeaking, and broke when he gave orders in excitement. He had the heart of a tiger, but the outward look of a cherub. The man only said that he was at Yorktown because it was the farthest point he could think of from New England." Nicholas was looking more serious. "I think they were the same 2, he said, "who manned the sloop that night we put Etienne Bordeaux on board his ship. Of the tall one I feel the most certain, for I saw a lank figure very like to his outlined against the sail. Did you note how the eyes of both of them were busy every instant that they were in the room, looking at each door and window, each desk and cupboard? I do not yet see what they thought they could gain by coming here. Surely no one could believe that we would give work to such an evident pair of rogues. Well, at least they took themselves away without too much argument." Michael also could make nothing of the fruitless effort of the 2 to find employment in the shipyard. He was not certain that they were the same 2 whom they had caught sight of on the sloop, and he was inclined to think them merely an exceptionally stupid and clumsy couple of vagabonds, and dismissed the question for talk of more important things. A few days later, however, sudden and disagreeable light was shed upon the matter. Nicholas and Michael happening to come, the first ones in the morning, to the door of the counting-house, stopped in amazement upon the threshold. "It looks as though the Furies had been at work," Michael exclaimed, after a long whistle of surprise and dismay. The place was in the most frantic confusion. Books, papers, maps, drawings had been flung hither and thither in some headlong and hasty search. Every desk had been ransacked. Every cupboard had been turned out. The inner room had been broken into also, and here the disorder was even worse. Chairs had been overturned. The big drawing table had been upset as it was thrust back against the wall. The half-dozen drawers of paper and records had been turned upside down bodily, and their contents flung upon the floor. The window at the end of the smaller room, by which the invaders had entered, was still standing open, swinging upon its hinges, showing a broken lock. "They must have come in a boat at high tide," said Nicholas, leaning far over the window-sill to look down at the tall, slippery piling below. There was a narrow ledge at the top of the piles where an active man, provided he was sufficiently tall, could have stepped from a boat and reached the window frame. The watchman, whose duty it was to patrol the yards at night, would have been certain to discover any person who attempted to enter the building from any one of the 3 other sides. But it was quite true that a boat might have slipped in under cover of the darkness at the height of the tide, and rising to some tall combing wave, could have reached high enough for a man to spring to the narrow footing and grasp the window-sill. Once there, he could have pulled up a shorter comrade to join him. "They are a somewhat more clever pair than we counted them as being," observed Michael, as they began to attempt to bring order out of the wanton confusion which the invaders had left behind. "As far as I can see, they have taken nothing away with them. The thing that they were looking for, they have failed to find." It was true that there had been no robbery of any sort. There was only paper currency locked up in the money drawer of the big desk. What little they possessed of real coin had been carried away to a place of safer deposit. Nicholas had thought a little of placing the letter where the gold and silver was stored, but he hesitated to let it go out of his own hands, fearful of its being seen and investigated by no matter how trustworthy a clerk. He had carried it in the inner pocket of his coat, at first simply because he had not thought to put it elsewhere, and later because he began to doubt the safety of any lock or hiding place. Michael had offered to take possession of the disagreeable missive, which must be so carefully guarded, but Nicholas had declined. "It was given to me, so it is I who must keep it, though the thing is as troublesome as a keg of gunpowder. I wish Darius had never let it slip through his fingers in the first place. It ought to be possible to find out those 2 marauders and cast them into the town jail," Michael declared when they had finally set the room once more to rights. "Such a conspicuous pair, once seen by anyone, could not fail to be recognized again. No person could forget those 2 ugly forms and faces. Etienne Bordeaux spoke the truth when he said that Darius Corland did not choose his subordinate rascals well." He stood a moment thinking, yet in a moment he burst out, "Oh, Nicholas, Nicholas, I did not do well when you and I conferred that day with Darius and his chase dog Joseph Ryle. It was I who let drop word of the French ship, and so gave proof that our doings were somehow bound up with Etienne's. Can I never learn to hold my tongue, strutting coxcomb that I am?" Nicholas sought to reassure him. A man so determined as Mr. Corland would presently have discovered, somehow, where the letter had gone, he insisted. "Many times I am tempted to give the paper back to him, or to burn it." To this, Michael offered determined remonstrance. "As Etienne said, it is a talisman to be used in time of need. We are wiser to keep it. We can never tell what the future holds for us." No inquiry in the village, no searching by even more able persons than pottering Joshua Barstow, managed to reveal any traces of those 2 who had broken into the counting-house. Conspicuous though they were in appearance, they appeared to have enough cleverness between them to escape without leaving any clue behind. They were gone, and there was no way of discovering whither save by asking Darius, a suggestion of Michael's which neither of the friends cared to carry into effect. Nicholas, however, weary of the continual consciousness of that much-discussed letter in his pocket, had at least managed to rid himself of it. He had mounted, one evening, to the loft of the shed for no more adventurous purpose than to throw down hay to Dobbin, and in the dark, where no man could see him, he had by sudden impulse drawn out the paper and thrust it under one of the beams of the roof, where it lay pressed close between the timber and the shingles. Then he went his way, saying no word, even to Michael, of what he had done. As the weeks passed, dust gradually gathered thick over the lurking-place of the letter. A busy spider spun its curtain to cover the spot still more completely. It was as thoroughly lost, as completely safe, as though locked away in the stoutest strong-box in the colony of Massachusetts. Even Nicholas finally began to forget its unwelcome existence. On Michael's urging, he had, some time before, taken the precaution of storing one of Thomas Drury's long-barreled pistols in the locker in the counting-house where he kept his drawings, in case of surprise by some unwelcome visitor. But as time went by, without any hint of further disturbance, he finally pushed the unwieldy thing under a heap of papers and laughed at himself for keeping it there. On such of the long summer evenings as he was not working to late hours in the counting-house, he, Dolly, and Michael used to sit in the little room at the back of the inn, looking out upon the garden where the grass was so thick and green, and where the orange red fruit of the plum trees was slowly deepening to ripe crimson. Or they would walk, all three of them, down to the marsh road, where they would stand listening to the slow sliding of the long swells up the beach, while some awakened water-bird, roused from its sleep in long marsh grasses, would go winging its way above their heads. They would come back again, up through the garden, and see the candle at Mr. Thomas Drury's window, shining through the crooked branches and slender leaves of the plum trees. Since Darius Corland had taken formal possession of the big house, with its orchards and gardens, this place was home now, home where they were well cared for and not unhappy, where Thomas Drury was slowly, very slowly, coming back to strength once more. The two had been friends, Nicholas and his sister, with Michael, from the very day of their first meeting. They were growing now to know each other in that intimacy of an intent and common purpose, which knits friendship to its very closest. It was Dolly who felt free to ask, quite easily one evening, "Michael, why do we not see any more that beautiful dangle of chain and seals which hung from your watch pocket the first day we laid eyes upon you?" The red-haired boy explained without a shadow of embarrassment. "The seals, and the watch with them, are far on their voyage to England or Gibraltar, in the portly pocket of a British naval officer, and in exchange his good gold guineas are helping to raise up the Jocasta for the glory of America." "Oh," she cried, "how could you part with it?" "It was not so difficult. Certainly when that ferret-eyed Joseph Ryle challenged me to say what I had brought to this enterprise, I could think of nothing else. The British captain saw me take the watch out of my pocket, asked to see it, actually appeared to fall in love with it, and he held it in his hand. When he asked me whether I would part with it for 100 guineas, I was furious with his impertinence. I informed him that I did not chance to be a goldsmith or a peddler of jewelry, told him that the watch was my father's, and nothing would tempt me to give it up. I fumed over what I termed his vulgar impudence for a whole day, while Etienne laughed at me. It is strange how one's ideas change. I wished so much to aid in the building of the Jocasta that I traveled hotfoot back to Boston in a fearful turmoil lest the man's ship had sailed. I did not even mind taking back all my words and pocketing the Englishman's money, and I will say for him that he was sufficiently a gentleman not to mock at me. Little by little, Michael told the other two much of living on the big plantation, as far removed from their life as though it were in some other world. He spoke of the big white house under the eucalyptus trees, of the rows of tiny cottages which were the slave quarters, of the Negroes picking cotton in the hot sun, or sitting at the doors of their cabins in the evenings, singing all together in the warm darkness. He told of the raccoon hunts by torchlight, with a crowd of sportsmen walking through the woods, while the dogs coursed hither and yonder seeking the quarry, of the far-off baying of some wise old hound's tree bark, as the negroes called it, when it had found the victim and had driven it to take refuge among the branches. Then some agile black youth would go shinning up the trunk to shake down the snarling coon, where it would roll and tumble and bite among the dogs, and often put up so excellent a fight that it would get clean away. He described to them also another race than the Negroes, the Seminole Indians, who still clung to their homes in the swampy forests to the south. Indians had almost vanished from the New England seaboard, so that Dolly and Nicholas had seldom seen any and knew nothing of their ways of living. Michael had camped and hunted with them from the time he was a small boy. For one old chief, he had formed a great friendship, and had learned much from him, both as to the best manner of shooting deer and wild turkeys, and as to the traditions and beliefs which his people usually guarded jealously from the whites. Dolly loved particularly to hear of the great company which gathered in the big parlor, of the ladies in their powder and brocaded petticoats, the gentlemen quite as fine, with their jeweled buttons, satin coats, and lace ruffles. There was much fiery oratory to be heard within those high white walls, where the tremendous questions of the times, leading up to the Revolution, were argued and re-argued. Most especially did Nicholas enjoy accounts of that friend of Michael's father, whom the men of that neighborhood called Long Tom Jefferson. He would sit by the fire in the big armchair, with his lengthy legs crossed, and tell all the others truths which they refused to believe. "You can make men free, yes," most of his hearers would maintain, "but you can never make them equal. There will always be some higher and some lower." To which Mr. Jefferson would shake his head and reply, "I know better than that, and you will also in time." Once he had looked around and had seen the youngest son of the house staring and listening with all his soul, and had said, "Here is one who believes me. Is it not so, Michael?" And the boy had agreed seriously, "It is so indeed." It was not until he had known the two many months that he had came to relate to them, stumblingly, as though he had never put the story into words before, the tale of his father's death. Nicholas had been commenting on the easy skill with which he had, that afternoon, bound up the hammer-bruised finger of one of the shipwrights. "You could not have done it better yourself, Dolly," Nicholas declared, for Dolly's fingers were well known for their handling of bandages. Michael protested. "No man ever does such things as well as a woman. As I have told you, what little I can do is because my mother taught me." And then haltingly, but with determination, as though it were a relief to speak of the thing nearest his heart, he told them of the one occasion when his mother's courage and spirit had failed her. His father, the lord of broad acres, had had some slight difference in a Charleston tavern, a dispute over politics, with the owner of the neighboring estate. Mr. Cheevers had come to the house to renew the argument, and the talk had lasted long into the summer night, with their anger, instead of spending itself in talk, growing hotter and more intense as the hours passed. They had fought a duel at sunrise on the long terrace above the rose garden, and Michael, then a boy of 13, had been roused from his bed by a terror-stricken Negro servant to "Come tend to the massa." He had run down to see his mother lying like a dead woman on the parlor floor, where in the big room, shadowy in the morning twilight, she had tried to dress the mortal wound of the master of the house. Michael had labored to extract the bullet and check the flow of blood, but his boy skill was to no purpose. It was evening before my brother could fetch the doctor from the nearest town, although he rode the Blue Roan, the best horse in 3 counties. Dr. Shannon said that I had done all that any man could do. He himself could accomplish scarcely anything more, and my father died before morning. Mr. Cheevers, our neighbor, had walked the floor in the big parlor all night. I could hear his feet going up and down as I watched beside the bed. I went down to tell him what happened at last. I can never forget the gray look on his face as he cried out, "God knows I never meant that it should end like this." He went stumbling away through the long window that opened on the terrace and walked out through the garden, and we never saw him again. Nicholas and Dolly had listened aghast. Dueling was so much less common in New England than in the more southern colonies that they had never heard just such a tale before. They were both so stricken with their friend's grief that neither could speak, and it was Michael finally who had to lead the talk to more cheerful things. It was from that hour that they all knew that the friendship had gone so deep that nothing could ever come between them. In these days, the ship's carpenters worked up to the very edge of the late darkness to push the work forward. It is a long task to build a ship, a far more intricate one even than the building of a dwelling. A house is an erection of straight walls and square corners, of simple elements and long-established methods. But a ship is a bewildering matter of curves and slants, with never a right angle in the whole of her. The oak planks must be as stout as nature can make them, but they must bend and taper and fit one into the next, with never a space between. If wind creeps through a crevice in the wall of a dwelling, there is discomfort and shivering within. But if water, always seeking and always jealous to destroy those who set sail upon it, finds a place for entry, there is not discomfort, but disaster. That the Branscombe venture should go forward with speed was of great importance. That it should be a safe and successful one was more important still. The clinking music of caulking tools now went echoing up and down the shipyards, while the pungent smell of tarred oakum filled the air. The twisted skeins of the spun oakum seemed to disappear like magic into the sides of the great hull, which now stood towering upon the ways. A few months before, in that open space, there had been nothing, and now, by some miracle of imagination coupled with industry, here was this majestic vessel, beautiful in her grace and waiting power. Presently she would sail away into that great blue, dreaming expanse of water which lay waiting for her. Every long wave that came slipping and creeping up to break among the piles or along the shingle seemed to carry the message, "How soon are you coming?" Upon every puff of warm wind carrying the scent of hemp, tar, and fragrant new lumber, bearing the ringing sound of hammers and eager voices, there seemed to ride the answer, "Before long, before long." Nicholas, looking up at her as she stood, sometimes against the clear, transparent light of early morning, sometimes against the soft dark and a myriad of stars, used to wonder strangely how she could have come there. From the strain of responsibility and toil, he was now unbelievably weary, so that both body and brain required urging, and neither served him as once they had done. Although all was going forward with the greatest of smoothness, and all hearts were full of hope, he, for very exhaustion from the long labor, was beginning to doubt. Had he done well to lead all these trusting folk into this great undertaking? Could anybody, in these uncertain times, have unshakable belief in himself and in what was before them all? Was he conducting these good comrades of his toward even greater disaster than had faced them in the beginning? He could only make up his mind that he had laid out a course for them all, and that at one time he had thought, with the whole strength of his spirit, that it was the right one. To that course he would cling, no matter what headwinds of doubt and weariness and disappointment sought to beat him back or drive him from the way. That was the utmost he could do. He was thinking of all these things as he stood on a night which was verging into morning before his drafting table in the small room of the counting-house. He had given the finishing touches to the set of drawings which would complete the deckworks of the Jocasta, and would be the last needed to complete her hull and make it ready for the launching. He could scarcely believe, as he put down his pen, that this laborious portion of the great task was finally at an end. He heard the watchman on his rounds tramp the length of the big room outside, shut the outer door, and go trudging away. It was after midnight, long since time for him to go home to the Blackbird Inn and to bed. How heavily weary he suddenly found himself to be. With slow, clumsy fingers, he rolled up the drawings, carried them to the cupboard in the wall, locked the door, and dropped the key into his pocket. He sat down upon the high stool to set himself to the task of clearing the table of its odds and ends left over from the work. Ink, spoiled pens, scraps of paper with calculations upon them. He must try to hurry, he thought dimly. Dolly and Phoebe would both chide him in the morning when they knew, and they always did know, how late he had toiled in that room above the wharf. Yet he was so spent that he could make no haste. He had used his entire energy for finishing the work, and had left none with which to set the last matters in order, and to carry himself home. He had forgotten that even that little more effort would be needed. He told himself more than once that he need not really make such attempts to hurry, although he knew all the time that he must be gone. It would do no harm, however, to lay his arm along the table and drop his head upon it for a single moment of rest. He did so, and in an instant was asleep. The window above the water stood open in the warm night air. The tide was coming in, the long ripples washing higher and higher against the piling. There was little other sound, save for the sudden excited call of a killdeer, winging its squawking way overhead. It was true that after its harsh cry had dropped into silence, there was still a faint noise, something like the creaking of oars, very carefully dipping oars, but still not quite silent in their rowlocks. Nicholas heard neither water, bird, nor boat, but slept the heavy slumber of complete exhaustion. The candle guttered, burnt low, and went out, leaving the room dark. The tide came steadily up and up below the window. He startled awake, not knowing what had broken his slumber, but aroused into immediate and complete alertness. A hand, a soft, stealing hand, had sought to thrust itself inside his coat. The boy, instantly on his feet, faced a tall man who had come noiselessly across the floor to lean over him, and who now started back and took up one of a pair of pistols which he had laid upon the table. It was plain to Nicholas that he had been asleep for a long time. The room was no more in darkness, for daylight was almost come, with a strip of red showing along the horizon beyond the open window. It gave striking backgrounds for the head and broad shoulders of a second man, thrust through the narrow frame with his elbows on the sill. It made plain, by faint radiance drifting past into the room, that the other intruder, he whose hand had that moment been in Nicholas's pocket, was stepping warily to the opposite side of the table, where he sat down, laying the two heavy pistols upon the board before him, and keeping one of his long hands resting upon the butt of each. "You may sit down also," he directed impotently, "for we have one or two things to say to you." He had dropped completely that uncouth manner of a laborer seeking hire, which he had assumed at their former meeting. "We have waited very patiently, my comrade and I, for the tide to lift us within reach of your window, and now we have not many minutes to waste. We would like to have, at once, that which we believe you carry in your inner pocket. My comrade is of a tender nature, and did not enjoy the thought of putting a bullet through your head as you slept. Otherwise, I would have had the paper in my hands already." "How do you come to think that it is in my inner pocket?" asked Nicholas, fencing for delay, although he knew of little good which it might do him. "Because I have felt in all the outer ones, while you were wrapped in sweet and dreamless slumber," replied the man coldly. "And we have, at other occasions, taken the liberty of searching all your possessions, and have not found it. We know, at last, just where the letter lies." "You have no proof of my having such a letter at all," Nicholas maintained. The other laughed shortly. "Do you see my comrade in the window? We will call him Hezekiah Truman, that not being his name. He is a good fellow. His only fault is that he scarcely knows his own mind. When he is safe and moderately prosperous, he has many noble ideas concerning truth and honor and similar nonsense. When he feels the pinch of want, they crumble into nothing. It was to him that the letter was given by the man who wrote it, to be carried to England. In some fantastic freak of imagined gratitude, he gave it to Etienne Bardot. The Frenchman had saved him from being flogged by a company of rough fellows whom Hezekiah had happened to displease. The tale is too long to tell you now. Then the boasting fool must needs pluck up heart and tell the writer of the letter what he had done with it, and that he would serve him as a go-between no longer. Do you follow what I am saying?" "Yes," said Nicholas. "Go on." "I need not warn you that one call for the watchman will usher you promptly into the next world," went on the tall man, grasping one of the pistol butts a little more firmly. "Not even our squeamish Hezekiah would hesitate for that, I am certain. You will notice that my companion has a pistol also, and I assure you that he is a good enough marksman at such short range. You will observe, moreover, that while you slept, I took the precaution to shoot that bolt which holds the door. You were wise to have so heavy a one. It should hold against a regiment. Now we will go forward with our little talk. I do not know quite why I make all this so plain to you, save to let you understand that the man who sent me hither is not to be outwitted. As I was saying, our good Hezekiah boasted of his purity of principles to his master, but he was made to suffer for his treachery and speedily brought to a different frame of mind. He was sent post-haste to find this Etienne Bardot, and I will say for Hezekiah that here, at last, he showed some little wit. Without letting the Frenchman know that he had real interest in the letter, he got from him the certain knowledge that it had been given to you. That brings us," he concluded pleasantly, "to the end of the story, the last paragraph, in which our young hero gives the writer of the letter his own again." "We have not reached that yet," declared Nicholas steadily, "and we will not reach it. You may tell Darius Courland—" The man jumped to his feet, snatching up his weapon. "Speak that name again," he cried, "and it is the last word you will ever utter. I will tell you this much of that person, however, that he bade us stop at nothing to regain his property. Now, will you give up the letter, or do we take it from you?" They faced each other for a moment of silence, and in that stillness they heard the far outer door open as two men came in. "Nicholas must have come before us," said Michael Slade, "or the smaller door would be ajar. The watchman always leaves it so." "I suppose we must not disturb him," answered the gruff voice of Caleb Harmon, who seemed to have stopped beside the outer door. "There is no use in waiting. I can return later. Do you come with me, Master Slade, for I want you to see that biggest timber with which I am not satisfied. Since Master Nicholas is too busy to look at it, you must." "A moment," answered Michael. "I must put these records into my desk." His feet came down the long room and drew close, while those within heard the creak of the desk lid and the rustling of paper. At the first sound of his voice, the tall man had leaned across the table and rested the cool metal of the pistol muzzle against Nicholas's temple. His eyes and an ugly, mirthless grin, which overspread his face, told what he dared not say, lest he be overheard. All three were motionless. almost without breathing, as the desk lid outside snapped down and Michael moved away. Involuntarily, Nicholas stirred in his chair, and the tall man leaned closer. "Do you so much as take a long breath, as though for crying out, and you are done," he said, though scarcely audible, even a foot from Nicholas's ear. The smaller man stretched his head as far into the room as he could, and spoke in an anxious, hissing whisper. "Never fire that weapon here within the room," he warned his comrade. "It will bring the whole hornet's nest about our ears. As soon as the door closes, we can swing him, together, out through the window. And while he is struggling in the water, Jennings can smite him over the head with an oar. Once stunned, and in the boat, we can have our will of him, but it will be the end of us if you fire." "Hold your peace," ordered the other. He chanced aloud to whisper, for Michael was at the farther door. Nicholas had sat without moving except for his eyes, which went from one to another. Even with the inexperience of his years, he was something of a judge of men. He could see that Hezekiah was an irresolute coward, but that the man beside him was possessed of brains and determination as well as villainy. It would mean little to him to blow his victim into another world, if it would serve his purpose. Yet, at this moment, crafty as the rascal was, he was committing the mistake of listening too intently to the departing footsteps outside. He had turned his head ever so little to hear the sound of the far door swinging open. With a lightning-quick upward movement of his arm, Nicholas struck up the muzzle of the pistol at his head and grasped the lean wrist which held the other. "Michael!" he shouted with all the strength of his lungs as he sprang to his feet. "Michael!" End of Chapter 5.